The stars had watched humanity for a long time before the ships came. On the night they arrived, people around the world looked up at the sky and saw lights moving in ways that lights should not move. They stopped and started. They changed direction without slowing down. They until the darkness itself seemed alive with them. The covenant of 12 species had kept peace in the galaxy for 11,000 years. They did this by finding dangerous creatures before those creatures could become a problem. Their observation probes had watched Earth for centuries, recording everything. They saw humans discover fire. They saw humans build cities and tear them down. They saw humans split the atom and create weapons that could destroy everything they had ever built. That was when the Covenant decided to act. The ships landed in every major city on Earth at exactly the same moment. The beings that came out of them looked nothing like humans. Some had too many limbs. Some had no limbs at all. Some floated in tanks of strange liquid. But they all spoke with perfect calm, and their translators made their words clear in every human language. "We come as friends," they said. "We offer you a place among the stars." The governments of Earth met with the aliens for 3 days. The meetings happened in a building that the Covenant ships had created overnight, a structure of smooth white walls that seemed to hum with hidden power. Human leaders came in looking hopeful. They came out looking pale. The Covenant's offer was simple. Humanity would be allowed to join galactic civilization. They would receive advanced technology, medicine that could cure any disease, access to faster-than-light travel. In return, they would agree to certain rules. Human population would never exceed 12 billion. Human technology would develop only in directions the Covenant approved. Human children would receive conditioning treatments to reduce aggressive impulses. Human colonies would be established only on worlds the Covenant selected. Human military forces would serve the Covenant, not human governments. And if we refuse, ask the President of the United European States. The Covenant ambassador, a tall creature with gray skin and 6 eyes, tilted its head in a way that might have been sympathetic. "Then we leave, and when your nuclear weapons finally destroy your world, we will record it for our archives as a cautionary example. Your species shows great promise. It would be a shame to waste it." The leaders of Earth looked at each other. They looked at the ships hovering over their cities, ships that could level mountains with a thought. They looked at the problems they had been unable to solve, the wars, the famines, the slow poisoning of their own planet. They signed the treaty. For the first generation, things seemed better. Disease disappeared. Hunger ended. The new technology made life easier in 1,000 ways. Children grew up calmer, kinder, less prone to violence. The conditioning treatments worked exactly as promised. Some people complained, of course. They said humanity was giving up its freedom. They said the Covenant was treating humans like pets. But those people were gently corrected by counselors trained in the Covenant's methods. Most of them eventually agreed that they had been wrong. The ones who did not agree simply stopped being heard from. By the second generation, hardly anyone remembered what Earth had been like before. By the third generation, the old ways seemed like barbaric history, embarrassing to think about. Humans spread across a dozen worlds, working in Covenant mines and factories, serving on Covenant ships, creating art that Covenant collectors prized for its raw emotional power. They had become exactly what the Covenant wanted them to be. Doctor was 53 years old when she discovered the truth. She worked as a on-prime, the Covenant's main administrative world. Her job was to study the cultures of the Covenant's member species, to help humans understand their new neighbors. She was good at her job, so good that they eventually gave her access to the archives. The archives held the history of every species the Covenant had ever encountered. Millions of years of records, stored in crystalline matrices that would last until the stars burned out. Spent months learning to navigate them, reading about civilizations that had risen and fallen long before life existed on Earth. Then she started looking for the species that had been uplifted before humanity. She found 17 of them. The first, a reptilian race called the, had been integrated into the Covenant 8,000 years ago. The records spoke of them in glowing terms, a proud people who had made the wise choice to accept guidance. Their population had grown. Their culture had flourished. They had contributed greatly to Covenant society. For 2,000 years. Then the records became sparse. A note about population decline, a reference to cultural preservation efforts, a final entry marking this reclassification as a heritage species. Searched for current records about the. She found nothing. They had simply vanished from galactic records about 6,000 years ago, as if they had never existed at all. She checked the other 16 species. 14 of them showed the same pattern: integration, apparent prosperity, gradual decline, disappearance. The remaining 3 still existed, but barely. Their total populations combined would not have filled a mid-sized human city. They lived on reserve worlds, their cultures preserved like exhibits in a museum. Worked for 3 more years, carefully hiding her research from Covenant surveillance. She documented everything. She created backups. She looked for patterns. The pattern was clear. The Covenant did not destroy species outright. They did not need to. They simply made them comfortable, made them dependent, made them forget how to be themselves. Generation by generation, the fire went out. And when it was gone, when a species could no longer survive without Covenant support, they quietly faded away. Humanity was 300 years into the process. Brought her findings to the Human Liaison Council, the body that represented human interests to the Covenant. She showed them her evidence. She begged them to act. They thanked her for her service. They recommended that she take a long rest. Her research credentials were revoked 3 weeks later. 1 month after that, disappeared from her apartment in the middle of the night. Her daughter, a girl of 19 named, came home to find her mother's belongings packed and shipped to storage, as if had simply decided to move away. The Covenant officials who interviewed were very kind, very concerned. They had no idea where her mother might have gone, but had found the data chip hidden in her childhood toy, the stuffed rabbit she had kept since she was 5. She had seen her mother hide things before, small rebellions against a system that watched everything. She knew not to tell anyone. She kept the chip, she waited, and she began to pay attention to things she had never noticed before. On Earth, in the vast urban sprawl that had once been Singapore and now stretched across most of the Malaysian peninsula, a dockworker named was having a very bad day. He had dropped a cargo container, damaged some Covenant equipment, and now faced the prospect of punishment duty in the deep mines. His supervisor, a human woman with the calm eyes and steady voice that the conditioning gave everyone, told him that accidents happened. She told him that punishment would help him become more careful. She told him that the Covenant only wanted what was best for him. Nodded and agreed because that was what you did. Inside, though, something stirred, something that the conditioning had never quite been able to reach. After his shift, instead of going home, walked into the old city. The parts of New Singapore that the Covenant had not rebuilt still stood, crumbling and abandoned, officially dangerous and forbidden. Had been exploring them since he was a teenager, finding places where the surveillance did not reach. In a collapsed building that had once been a library, he found a box. Inside the box were books, real books printed on paper, hidden by someone long ago. Could read, but he had never held a physical book before. The words seemed different on paper, heavier somehow, more real. He picked one at random and began to read. It was a history of the Second World War. Names he had never heard before filled the pages. Churchill. Cities burned. Armies clashed. Millions died for causes that barely understood. But one chapter caught his attention. It was about a place called Stalingrad, a city where human beings had fought for months in the ruins, where soldiers and civilians alike had refused to surrender even when surrender made logical sense. They had chosen death over defeat. They had won. Read about the Warsaw Uprising, where people with almost no weapons had risen against an enemy that should have crushed them. He read about resistance movements in a dozen countries, ordinary people who had risked everything rather than live on their knees. Something woke up inside him, something he had no name for, something the conditioning had tried to kill but had only put to sleep. He took the book with him when he left. Over the following weeks, he came back for more. He read about every war, every revolution, every moment in history when humans had faced impossible odds and refused to kneel. And he began to talk to others, carefully, quietly, in places where the surveillance could not reach. He found that he was not alone. Everywhere he looked, once he knew how to look, he found people with the same hungry expression, the same sense that something was wrong with the world. The fire that should have gone out 3 centuries ago had not gone out. It had only been banked, buried under layers of conditioning and comfort. And now, slowly, it was beginning to smolder again. Did not know it yet, but he had just lit the spark that would eventually burn an empire. The silence started on 442b, a world so far from Earth that its sun was just another dot in the night sky. 30,000 humans lived there, working in the mines that extracted rare minerals for Covenant Industries. It was hard work, dangerous work, but the conditioning helped them accept it. They were grateful for the opportunity to serve. Then the tunnel collapsed. It happened in the deep shafts, 2 kilometers below the surface. A support beam failed, then another, then a whole section of ceiling came down. 200 miners were trapped behind tons of rock, with limited air and no way out. The survivors sent for help immediately. Mining accidents had happened before. There were protocols. But this time, the Covenant overseers did something different. Overseer was a member of the species that had joined the Covenant 5,000 years ago. They were excellent administrators, famous for their logical minds and their complete lack of emotional attachment. Looked at the rescue cost estimates, compared them to the economic output of 200 human workers over their remaining lifetimes, and made a decision. Seal the tunnels, he ordered. The human shift supervisor, a man named David Park, stood very still for a moment. Overseer, he said, his voice flat with the effort of staying calm, there are 200 people down there. I am aware, said. The cost of retrieval exceeds their value. This is unfortunate but necessary. They're still alive. We can hear them on the radio. For now, the oxygen will run out within 18 hours. It is more efficient to wait. David Park had worked in the mines for 20 years. He had always followed orders. The conditioning made following orders feel right, natural, the only sensible choice. But something cracked inside him when spoke those words. Something that had been building for years, maybe for his whole life, finally broke through. No, he said. Tilted his head. The translator rendered his response as mild confusion. I do not understand. This is not a request. I know what it is, and I'm saying no. We're not sealing those tunnels while people are alive in them. The overseer stared at David for a long moment. In 5,000 years of Covenant service, he had never heard a human refuse a direct order. The conditioning should have made it impossible. You will comply, said, or you will be disciplined. David Park looked at the other humans in the control room. He saw something in their eyes that he recognized, something that mirrored what he felt himself. They were afraid, but under the fear was something else. No, David said again, we won't. He sat down on the floor. After a moment, the others did the same. Called for security. Security came, but they were human too. They looked at the miners sitting on the floor, at the overseer demanding compliance, at the screens showing the radio signals from the trapped workers below. They sat down as well. News traveled fast, even in places where the Covenant controlled communications. Within hours, every human on 442b knew what had happened. By the next morning, no human on the planet was working. They simply stopped. They sat in their quarters in the mines in the processing facilities. They didn't riot. They didn't fight. They just refused to move. Did not understand what he was seeing. His psychological models predicted that the suppression protocols would activate, that the conditioning would reassert itself, that the humans would return to their normal docile state within hours. Instead, on the third day, they started to sing. It began in the mining barracks, a low hum that grew into words. Old songs, songs that should have been erased from human memory generations ago. Work songs from ancient Earth, spirituals from the time of slavery, anthems from wars that the conditioning was supposed to have made shameful. The singing spread. Miners sang, factory workers sang, even children sang songs they had never been taught, as if the words had been waiting in their blood. Cut their food supply, they sang. He cut their water, they sang. He threatened to execute the leaders. They had no leaders. Every human was a leader. Every human was also a follower. They moved together without coordination, thought together without speaking, resisted together without planning. On the fourth day, without food or water, with their voices cracking and their bodies failing, the humans of 442b sang louder than ever. And across the galaxy, other humans heard them. Not literally, of course. The distances were too great, the Covenant's communication controls too tight, but somehow in ways that no one could explain, the feeling traveled. On 17 other worlds, humans woke up with strange dreams. They hummed melodies they didn't remember learning. They looked at their Covenant overseers with new eyes. They stopped working. On station, 1,000 light-years from 442b, 300 human maintenance workers put down their tools at the same moment, without a word spoken between them. On New Vancouver, a human colony world, farmers walked away from their fields and sat down in the central square. On Covenant military vessels throughout the sector, human crew members began to slow down, to make small mistakes, to forget essential tasks. The silence spread like a virus, except it wasn't a virus. It was something older, something the Covenant had never encountered before. It was a species remembering what it used to be. The Covenant's response was predictable. They had suppressed unrest before, many times with many species. They knew what to do. On 3 worlds, they made examples. The death toll reached into the hundreds of thousands. Humans were killed in their homes, in the streets, in the fields where they sat refusing to work. The Covenant soldiers carried out their orders efficiently, without hatred, without passion. This was simply pest control. Every psychological model predicted that the massacres would break the movement. Terror always worked. Fear always won in the end. But the humans did not break. The survivors buried their dead, and then they sat down again. And now they had something they hadn't had before. They had martyrs. Doctor's daughter was 40 years old now. She had spent 20 years working her way into the Covenant's communications network, learning its systems, finding its weaknesses. She had kept her mother's data chip hidden all that time, waiting for the right moment. The moment had come. The information about the extinct species began to move, not through digital channels, which the Covenant controlled absolutely, but through older methods. Physical notes passed from hand to hand, words whispered in maintenance corridors, messages encoded in the rhythms of work songs. Humans learned what awaited them if they stayed obedient. They learned that their children's children would fade away, forgotten, another cautionary tale in the Covenant's archives. And something changed. On Earth, in the abandoned tunnels beneath New Singapore, stood before a gathering larger than any he had ever seen. 10,000 people filled the ancient subway station, their faces lit by chemical lamps that gave off no signals for Covenant sensors to detect. Was old now, his hair gray, his body worn from decades of hard labor and secret resistance. He had spent 30 years building this network, finding others who remembered, teaching them to find more. He did not give a rousing speech. He had never been good at speeches. He simply asked a question. "They're killing us," he said. "Slowly, but they're killing us, not just our bodies. They're killing what makes us human, our anger, our pride, our willingness to fight for what matters." He paused. "So I have to ask, what are we willing to lose to keep breathing? And what must we keep to stay alive in any way that matters?" The answer came back from 10,000 throats, a whisper that built into a roar, a sound that had not been heard on Earth for 300 years. The sound of a species refusing to die quietly. Above them, Covenant orbital platforms detected unusual energy signatures across 100 human population centers. Their algorithms, trained on centuries of compliant data, flagged the readings as industrial anomalies. It was the last mistake the Covenant would ever make about humanity. The Covenant Fleet Admiral received the first reports on a morning like any other. She was an elegant creature, tall and slender, with iridescent scales that shifted color with her moods. Her species, had been Covenant members for 9,000 years. They had risen to command the military through a combination of tactical genius and absolute loyalty. Human unrest was not a new problem. It happened every few generations, a brief flare of their primitive instincts before the conditioning reasserted itself. Had handled 3 such incidents in her career. They required firm action, nothing more. She authorized standard pacification measures and returned to more pressing matters. 3 weeks later, her flagship lost power in the middle of a routine patrol. "What happened?" she demanded, rising from her command throne. "Unknown, Admiral," her operations officer reported. His scales had gone pale with confusion. "All primary systems failing. Backups are not responding." The bridge lights flickered and died, replaced by the dim red glow of emergency power. Tactical displays went dark. Her communications cut out. For the first time in her long career, she was blind. Then the human crew members stood up. There were only 50 of them aboard, out of a complement of 3,000. They served in support roles, maintenance and cleaning, and the small tasks that other species found beneath them. They were supposed to be harmless. The ship's first officer, a human named James, walked toward the command platform. He moved slowly, deliberately, without aggression. The security officers raised their weapons. "I wouldn't," James said quietly. "Your weapons are powered by the same grid that just went down. So are your armor systems, your emergency beacons, your escape pods. Everything on this ship runs through systems that humans maintain." Scales flashed crimson with rage. "You dare. You made us into this, Admiral. You wanted us to run your infrastructure because we were good at it. You trained us to understand every system, every backup. You just forgot that we might choose to use that knowledge for ourselves. This is treason. The Covenant will destroy you." James smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "The Covenant is having a very bad day, Admiral. All across the sector, every ship with human crew is experiencing similar problems. So is every orbital platform, every communications relay, every power station." He paused to let that sink in. "We're not trying to kill you. We could, easily, but that's not what this is about. We're trying to show you something. For 300 years, you've treated us like tools, useful machines that happen to be made of flesh. You forgot that tools can choose who uses them." Processed this information with the tactical clarity that had made her famous. Across the sector, she realized, the Covenant's military infrastructure was collapsing. Not destroyed, just disabled. The humans had spent decades mapping every vulnerability, and now they were exploiting all of them at once. "What do you want?" she asked. "Freedom," James said. "Real freedom, not the comfortable cage you built for us. We want our worlds back. We want our children to grow up without conditioning. We want to choose our own future. And if we refuse? James's expression did not change. Then we start breaking things we can't fix. Your fleet loses power for a few hours. That's inconvenient. Your atmospheric processors on 100 stations fail permanently. That's a lot of dead people. We don't want that. But we're willing to accept it if the alternative is extinction by comfort. The negotiation took 17 hours. In the end, agreed to transmit a message to Covenant leadership recommending immediate talks. It was, she knew, only the beginning. The war that followed was unlike anything the Covenant had ever experienced. Human forces did not fight in patterns that made sense. They had no unified command, no central strategy, no clear objectives. Each ship, each world, each group of fighters made their own decisions, responding to situations as they developed, coordinating through methods the Covenant could not track or predict. Mining vessels rammed military installations. Transport ships carried suicide fighters who smiled as they died. Factory workers sabotaged equipment that had taken decades to build. Scientists released information about Covenant military secrets that had been classified for. The Covenant responded with overwhelming force as they always had. They destroyed human ships. They bombarded human worlds. They executed human prisoners by the thousands. Nothing worked. For every human killed, two more seemed to appear. They came from colonies the Covenant had forgotten about, from ships that had been written off as lost, from maintenance tunnels and service corridors where they had been waiting, planning, preparing. They came with weapons scavenged from Covenant stockpiles, with ships held together by desperate improvisation, with strategies that broke every rule of conventional warfare. They came without fear, or rather with fear that they had learned to use as fuel instead of paralysis. The Covenant could not understand enemies who did not value their own survival. They had evolved past such primitive thinking thousands of years ago. What was the point of fighting if you might die? What was the point of resistance if the odds were against you? They did not understand that humans had always known the odds were against them. They had fought anyway, throughout their history, because some things mattered more than living. The Battle of the Saul Gate lasted 8 days. It was the largest engagement of the war, 300 Covenant vessels against a ragged fleet of human ships that had no right to be a threat. The Covenant commander expected to destroy the human forces within hours. Instead, the humans used the gate itself as a weapon. The Saul Gate was one of the Covenant's great achievements, a massive structure that allowed ships to travel instantly between star systems. It had taken 2,000 years to build. It was considered indestructible. The humans crashed 17 ships into its power core simultaneously. The explosion was visible across light years. It destroyed the Covenant fleet. It destroyed most of the human ships as well. It sent shockwaves through the Covenant's transportation network that would take decades to repair. The survivors broadcasted one message before they died: "We don't need your gates, we'll build our own." After 11 months, the Covenant sued for peace. The Treaty of Saul was signed on Earth, in the ruins of the old United Nations building. Covenant representatives gathered under open sky for the first time in centuries, surrounded by humans who watched them with expressions that mixed triumph and exhaustion. The terms were simple. All human worlds would be released from Covenant jurisdiction. The conditioning programs would end immediately. The archives would be opened completely, including all information about the extinct species. The 3 surviving uplifted races would be freed from their reserves and allowed to rebuild. Admiral, stripped of rank and serving as one of the Covenant's negotiators, asked to speak with privately. They met in a small room overlooking the crater where New York had once stood, moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. The war had cost him 3 children and most of his health. He had won, and the victory had almost killed him. "I have a question," said. "Ask." "You could have destroyed us. At the end, when our fleet was crippled and our infrastructure was failing, you had the capacity to to exterminate us the way you believed we meant to exterminate you. Why didn't you? Was quiet for a long moment. Because that's what you expected, he said finally. You thought we were monsters. You thought our aggression was a disease that would eventually destroy everything it touched, including ourselves. You spent 300 years trying to breed it out of us. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much death. You were wrong. Our anger isn't a flaw, it's a tool. It keeps us alive when we should die. It lets us fight when we should surrender. But like any tool, it can be controlled. We can choose when to use it and when to put it down. He straightened slightly, and for a moment saw the young man who had found old books in an abandoned building, who had learned to remember when remembering was forbidden. We're not destroying you because we don't have to. You're beaten. You're going to leave us alone. That's all we ever wanted. More killing won't make us safer. It will just make us into the thing you were afraid of. Mercy then. No, shook his head. Not mercy, choice. We're choosing to let you live because that's who we want to be. We're choosing not to become conquerors because we saw what conquest did to you. You started as explorers thousands of years ago. You became jailers. We don't want to follow that path. He moved toward the door, then stopped. But understand this clearly, Admiral. We remember everything. Every death. Every child who grew up in chains. Every species that faded away under your care. We're choosing peace now. If you give us a reason to choose differently, you will find out exactly how dangerous we can be. The treaty was signed within the hour. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt. They removed the conditioning chemicals from their water supplies. They taught their children real history, including the parts that were painful and shameful. They reached out to the 3 surviving uplifted species and helped them remember who they had been. They built new gates, new ships, new worlds. They argued among themselves and fought their own small wars. They made mistakes and corrected them and made new mistakes. They were free, and freedom, they discovered, was messy and difficult and wonderful. 50 years after the treaty, a Covenant historian published a study that changed how her species understood humanity. She argued that the Covenant's psychological models had been fundamentally wrong. Human aggression was not a flaw, she wrote. It was not separate from their other qualities. It was woven through everything they were, connected to their love and their loyalty and their stubborn refusal to give up. You could not remove it without destroying them entirely. The Covenant had tried to bank the fire that burned in humanity's heart. They had thought they could make it safe, controllable, useful. Instead, they had only made it wait. And when it finally broke free, when it burned through all the chains and cages the Covenant had built, the whole galaxy learned an important lesson. Never try to tame a species that would rather die than kneel.